If we want to be happy, it seems there is one magic ingredient. It's found in the midst of war and in the Boy Scouts. But it tends to be gobbled up by television. Experts fear supplies are declining. But perhaps the ancient Greeks had an idea on where to get some more. In our search for happiness, we conducted a simple experiment. We wrote lots of letters to ourselves. Then we drove to Sevenoaks in Kent with a camera in our van. When the coast was clear, we quietly dropped 25 of the letters and filmed to see if anyone would pick them up. How civic-minded are they in Sevenoaks? Then it was off to Luton with another 25 letters. Sevenoaks is one of Britain's happiest places. Luton is not. Which town would return most letters? We want to test the scientific claim that happy places have got more community spirit. In the jargon, more social capital.
If you have high levels of social capital, you are more likely to be happy. Those communities that have got more trust, more voluntary associations and so on, tend to have higher levels of happiness and well-being.
So, how many letters came back? From Luton, 16, but from happy Sevenoaks, 24. It's not hard science, but our results come as no surprise to Professor Robert Putnam, a man whose views have been sought by world leaders. He has devoted his career to finding a way to measure social capital, the glue that holds communities together and seems to make people happier.
The core idea of social capital is so simple, I'm embarrassed to say it. It is that social networks have value. The best predictor, actually, of people's subjective well-being, of their happiness, actually is the sum of all of their social connections, their personal family ties, their friendship ties. That, by a long mark, is the best predictor of how happy we are. Much stronger connection between various forms of social capital and happiness than between wealth and happiness.
I think that humans are built to be social and to care about others, and we've evolved to be that way. When we look at the happiest people, without exception, that means every single one we've looked at, have strong, supportive social relationships. That tells me something. This isn't a correlation. This is a perfect relationship.
Now, Madge said to me she thought that the budgie was egg-bound. And I said, well, we'll have to do something about it.
There was, it said, a golden age of social capital, a time of street parties and looking out for your neighbour. Despite all the grimness of the post-war years, people were quite simply happier.
It's not just nostalgia. The data backs it up. In 1957, more than half the population described themselves as very happy.
Today, it's down to just over a third, which seems quite extraordinary.
He said, well, cremation is the most hygienic thing, madam. That will be 7 and 6.
This was the generation that had suffered the austerity of war, personal loss, destruction, rationing. I travelled to Portsmouth, a particular target for Hitler's bombers. The Germans didn't just want to destroy every building. They hoped to smash people's spirit.
I was here through all the bombing raids. One of the worst was the January the 10th bombing when pretty well the whole of the shopping areas of the city went up in flames. About 6 o'clock in the morning after the raid, all I could see as I looked around were flames leaping up into the sky.
The January raid smashed into the heart of the city. 3,000 were left homeless.
Did Hitler damage, do you think, morale, sap people's spirit?
Not a bit. Not a bit. It gelled us together.
Some people actually say that for them the war years were among the happiest in their lives.
It brought out the best of everybody. When there's an emergency, people seem to really rally round and they forget their differences and just want to help each other.
There you had a situation which absolutely every expert all predicted there would be mass catastrophe. There would be panic in the streets, civilian morale would collapse, there would be mass graves, and indeed we might lose the war. Then came the Blitz. It didn't happen.
The Germans broke through the charge of Hurricanes and Spitfires that went out to meet them.
Civilian rates of neurosis dropped. Suicide rate dropped. There was instead, again it's a cliche, but this is the time when the cliche is true, a coming together of people. There was an increase in community spirit, a decrease in psychiatric disorder, and an increase in resilience.
We asked NOP to carry out an opinion poll for this series. They called 1,000 people to find out how satisfied they were with their lives. Those who lived through the war were among the happiest. And the war generation is also highly trusting. Half of pensioners think most people can be trusted. Only 1/3 of under 25s think they can.
The simplest measure of social capital is just to ask the question, do you think other people can be trusted? And if the answer to that is yes, then as an individual, that's high social capital. But more importantly, if in a community or a country, people will say, yes, generally other people can be trusted, actually, that's telling you a lot about that society.
The most trusting country is Norway. 2/3 think most people can be trusted. But in Turkey, apparently, it's only 6%. And the British? Well, in the 1950s, 60% thought most people could be trusted. Today, it's fallen to about 30%.
Nearly all countries see a decline in social capital. So the standard ones, which would also apply to the UK, are declines in traditional institutions. So particularly churches, Women's Institute would be an example, working men's clubs.
There's been a big fall in social engagement in many of Britain's communities.
I can remember Sunday morning when I first started coming as a pot lad. If you weren't in at 11:30, you didn't get a seat. But there's only one dart team now. There's no pool team. There's no snooker team.
Yes! Sure not, you should. Hey, I tell you what. Sure that on camera. Sure on camera. That was genuine. That never ever happened.
There's 900 members now. Membership forms, yeah, there's 900 members. And originally, we peaked at 2,360. I think it had a big effect because at one time everybody knew the neighbours, and now people can live in the same street, in the same house, and they might know the next door neighbour either side, but apart from that, it's just killed the place, it's killed the village itself.
While working class community spirit has fallen, among the middle classes there's been a slight rise, or at least there appears to have been.
People often say, well, other forms of associations have come up, like there's a growth of Greenpeace or Oxfam and so on. But these tend to be very different kinds of organisations. Your sole engagement really is that you send off a cheque once a year.
It means you're plugged in, but not in a direct way.
That's right. It looks like a very thin form of social capital or trust or connection with other people.
Does it matter? Well, the science of happiness suggests that human beings are hardwired social creatures. If we don't socialise, we suffer.
It's a very serious problem because social isolation is for sure bad for our happiness. People live longer if they're more connected with other people. Social isolation is as big a risk factor for premature death as smoking. So you're healthier, you get better jobs. In general, people are better off who are in networks.
So why have communities drifted apart? It seems the glue needed for our happiness is coming unstuck. The social rules which once governed our behaviour are often replaced by a culture of everyone for themselves.
One of the things that a modern society has to do is it does have to decide what are some of the kind of common rules and habits which we all sign up to. Often quite prosaic habits about, you know, a contemporary example would be how should cyclists behave in a city?
Should they go through a red light, for instance?
Right, is it okay or is it not? I mean, actually, we all sort of have to decide as to what's appropriate and what's not.
I don't think it is, by the way. What about queuing? Whatever happened to queuing?
Well, the British are still pretty good at queuing, but yeah, it would be...
bus stop.
The science suggests that building happy communities requires shared codes of behaviour. It's about being good citizens. Rights and responsibilities lie at the heart of modern politics. From there's no such thing as society, through back to basics, to the respect agenda, with its ASBOs and parenting classes.
We should be thinking not just what is good for putting money in people's pockets, but what's good for putting joy in people's hearts.
We have citizenship education, for example, and as most countries do now, or some forms of service learning. In some sense, you're trying to say, for everybody, these are the rules of the game. This is what's appropriate and this is what is not appropriate in our society.
When politicians are looking at issues, they should be saying to themselves, well, how are we going to try and make sure that we don't just make people better off, but we make people happier, we make communities more stable, we make society more cohesive?
There are other explanations as to why we're not as sociable as we once were. And one reason is right here: commuting.
Every 10 minutes more of additional commuting time cuts all forms of social capital by 10%. So 10 minutes more commuting time means 10% fewer club meetings and 10% fewer family dinners and 10% fewer local meetings and so on. And 20 minutes more means 20%.
We were told we had to get on our bikes and look for work. Mobility of labour would make us richer. But the science of happiness suggests its side effect was to make us less happy.
We live our lives in triangles. One point of the triangle is where we sleep, one point is where we work, and one point is where we shop. And what's happened is that people's triangles over the last generation have gotten much larger, the triangles in southeast England, for example. So government, I think, has an incentive to try to figure out how to keep those triangles smaller.
Because small triangles, good for social capital.
Small triangles, good for social capital, good for health, good for happiness.
So how can we keep our triangles small? Some government advisors think our politicians could take a lesson from the French.
You go to a French town and you find highly educated people who, born in the town, still living in the town, feel very much part of the community. They're living near their grandparents, etc. These are elements which promote the stability of marriage, the stability of communities, help to reduce crime.